The wealthiest 1% in America don't just have more money, they possess the tools that make money continue to multiply, while most others simply work to pay off debt. That's the difference between living in a house bought on credit and owning shares in the very bank that issues that credit. This was one of the passages that made me pause for a long time when I read it. Not because of the numbers, but because of how it exposed a paradox we often avoid. Every debt a family shoulders on one end is an asset for someone else on the other. And so, while one side sinks deep in anxiety, the other watches their assets swell, that asymmetry. This book names it with a seemingly dry concept: financialization. Devastate, likely a mistranscription or creative title, assuming the context suggests something like asterisk financialization or the finance curse, is not a book that presents cold theories. It's like a map charting a journey where finance, from being a servant, became the master. Its pages connect seemingly disparate pieces, from the 1970s when inflation, unemployment, and the oil shock shook the entire system, to the 1980s when politics opened the door for Wall Street to run wild, then to the 2000s when household debt surpassed income, ultimately collapsing in the mortgage crisis. Reading this book felt like stepping into a room where a blinding light shone directly on cracks we had only vaguely noticed before. It reveals why non-financial corporate profits flow back to the market instead of returning to factories, why student loans, once hailed as keys to knowledge, have become shackles binding an entire generation, why the promise of democratizing stock ownership through pension funds actually locked power into the hands of a small group. I want to ask you a question. If the entire system has operated to turn the debt of the many into the profit of the few, then how can we, those on the other side, define our economic freedom? Is freedom merely the ability to borrow more to survive, while real decision-making power rests with those who have turned money into a tool of control? This question isn't just for academics or policymakers, it's for all of us. Those of us who swipe our cards every day, sign loan agreements, or deposit retirement savings into some fund we never fully understand. This book forces us to confront a paradox. The stability of a few is built on the fragility of the many. And that's why I want to share this story with you. Not to offer a final solution, because a solution may not even exist, but to collectively trace the invisible threads tightening their grip on society. Perhaps you'll find anger here, perhaps sadness, or perhaps just a moment of silence. But I believe that silence is the starting point for a new awareness. Let's begin by reviewing this book. Finance, in the eyes of many today, is often associated with towering glass buildings, with cold numbers flickering on trading screens, with transaction speeds measured in millionths of a second. But if we step back thousands of years, the story emerges in an unexpected place: the city of Uruk. There, clay tablets inscribed with symbols for sheep, wheat, or jars of oil weren't just for record-keeping, but were promises a primitive form of contract to exchange for goods in the future. From those baked clay tokens, a new principle of human society gradually formed. People began to trust symbolized commitments. From ancient Rome to China, from Islamic empires to medieval Europe, financial fragments like early banks, bonds, shares, and public debt spread. Finance, at its fundamental level, is a social contract. I give you resources today in exchange for a promise of repayment with benefits tomorrow. It's the invisible glue that allowed groups of strangers to cooperate, building cities, armies, and empires together. But upon entering modern America, that role gradually reversed. Initially, finance was merely a servant, helping idle money flow to where it was needed, helping businesses expand factories, helping families buy homes, helping individuals save for the future. Yet, since the late 20th century, that servant suddenly became the master, dictating the rules for the entire economy. The first and most apparent sign lies in the cold numbers of profits. Before 1980, the entire financial sector accounted for only about 15% of corporate profits. 3 decades later, that number exploded, reaching over 40%. Meanwhile, the salaries of bankers, stockbrokers, and fund managers soared, becoming 70% higher than those in other professions. People working in finance began to emerge as a new elite class, not only controlling money, but also infiltrating politics, culture, and even how society measured success. Increasingly, we see a transformation in non-financial companies. If, for most of the 20th century, business leaders focused on increasing revenue, maintaining employment, and long-term stability, from the 1980s onwards, the sole metric seemed to be stock price. Instead of reinvesting profits, building new machinery, or expanding markets, many companies chose to funnel money into dividends and especially stock buybacks. There were periods when the money spent on shareholders even exceeded the profits earned, meaning businesses had to sell assets or cut investments to prop up stock prices. This loop became a paradox. Instead of the stock market raising capital for businesses, businesses became the ones feeding the stock market. The winners were short-term investors, hedge funds, and of course, executive boards who were compensated with stock. The losers were workers who lost stable jobs, long-term projects that were abandoned, and society that bore additional risks from an increasingly fragile economy. Here, finance was no longer just an intermediary tool. It began to shape behavior, impose thinking, and dictate the goals of the entire production sector. Non-financial businesses were gradually financialized, a silent but powerful distortion. It didn't stop there. This rise also pulled middle-class families and ordinary people into the maelstrom. As wages stagnated and living costs escalated, people borrowed more. From the 1980s, the ratio of household debt to disposable income steadily climbed, exceeding 130% by 2007. Mortgages, student loans, credit cards all became lifelines, but also tightening nooses. The paradox was borrowing in hopes of escaping poverty, but the more they borrowed, the more dependent they became on a system that generated profits for the wealthy. Banks and financial companies didn't miss the opportunity. They sold credit products as promises of hope, a home, a degree, a better future. But the price paid was always higher, especially for women, minorities, and the younger generation. High interest rates, penalty fees, bankruptcy risks all became burdens placed on those least able to withstand them. The story doesn't end with numbers. When families deposit money into pension funds, when companies pour profits into shareholders, when banks create new products to resell risk, all these flows ultimately converge on Wall Street. It's like a giant vacuum cleaner. Resources from society are pumped back into the pockets of a minority. The more the loop spins, the deeper the disparity. When the financial machine swallowed both businesses and households, people began to ask, how did America reach this turning point? The answer lies not in a single event, but in an interwoven series of historical, political, and economic events, small gears silently turning until the entire machine took a new path. In 1944, as World War II neared its end, Allied nations gathered in a small town called Bretton Woods. They needed to establish a new monetary order to prevent the chaos scene between the two world wars. The result was the US dollar, pegged to gold, becoming the foundation of the global financial system. All other currencies were tied to the dollar, and the US naturally held a central role. That was the moment when the dollar, not steel or automobiles, became this nation's greatest power export. However, no monopoly lasts forever. By the 1960s, as West Germany and Japan recovered strongly, America's manufacturing dominance faltered. War costs and trade deficits eroded gold reserves. In 1971, President Nixon was forced to revoke the commitment to exchange dollars for gold. The Bretton Woods system dissolved. To maintain the dollar's value, the U.S. government forged another agreement. Middle Eastern oil would only be traded in dollars. Thus, the petrodollar was born, turning oil into a new anchor protecting the U.S. currency. Despite this, the 1970s were filled with crises: high inflation, low growth, rising unemployment, a situation dubbed stagflation. The industrial economy declined while oil shocks escalated production costs. People were discontent, and businesses felt stifled by regulations, unions, and social movements. Amidst this, a silent countermovement formed. Corporations and financial elites began to reorganize, establish lobbying funds, research institutes, and pressure for policy reversals. From here, a new ideology permeated politics: the belief that free markets self-regulate better than any government intervention. When Ronald Reagan entered the White House in the early 1980s, the slogan, "Government is not the solution, government is the problem," resonated. This was more than just a phrase. It was a license to gradually dismantle all barriers between different types of banking, between investment and commerce, between finance and other sectors. The consequence was a wave of deregulation, paving the way for the consolidation of colossal institutions. The firewalls erected after the Great Depression of the 1930s, designed to safeguard the system, were abolished. By the end of the century, Wall Street was no longer constrained, but had become an omnipotent empire. Concurrently, within manufacturing corporations themselves, a shift in mindset occurred. Instead of evaluating success by sales or long-term sustainability, executive boards were now compelled to prove value through stock prices. The theory of shareholder value maximization became the new gospel. Business leaders were compensated with stock options, and if stock prices fell, they could be replaced. As a result, long-term investment decisions were cast aside, yielding to short-term financial strategies to beautify the numbers. Parallel to this, changes in the pension system also drew millions of households into the financial orbit. Instead of company-guaranteed pensions, workers were encouraged to switch to private retirement funds tightly linked to the stock market. Now, their future old age depended on stock market fluctuations, and once again, Wall Street became the arbiter of individual well-being. This picture paints a profound paradox. While people struggled with inflation, debt, and insecurity, finance swelled bigger than ever. It was backed not only by profits, but also by policy, law, and social belief. In a few decades, its role had flipped from a tool supporting production and consumption to the central axis of the economy, dominating both politics and daily life. Looking back, we see this was not a natural evolution of capitalism. It was the result of choices, international agreements, political decisions, and pressures from the business world. And once that wheel started turning, the inevitable consequence was the concentration of power and wealth in the hands of a minority. The servant had become the master, and the price society paid was an ever-widening gap between rich and poor, an increasingly fragile economy. From prehistoric times, humans have always divided themselves. Some revered, some despised. Some possessed celebrated intellect, others were deemed ignorant. Some lived full, prosperous lives, while others toiled their entire existence facing deprivation. Among myriad forms of inequality, one silent power orchestrates all others: economic inequality. It determines who lives in a warm home, who endures the cold streets, who receives timely medical care, who struggles to the point of exhaustion, who gets a full education, and who is pushed to the margins early. But more importantly, it dictates invisible things: opportunity, freedom, dignity, or simply the feeling of peace when going to sleep. This is not a new problem. Shakespeare's plays featured an old king regretting how little he thought of the suffering of the poor. And Adam Smith, in the 18th century, warned that a society could not flourish when the majority of its people lived in poverty. By the 19th century, with the rise of industry, the social question became increasingly haunting. Why could the economy produce immense wealth, yet leave vast numbers of laborers hungry and cold? These debates have never ended. They merely change form and return in different contexts. Today, many voices still try to downplay the issue. Some argue that the poor in America live better than in many other parts of the world, so inequality is not overly concerning. Others believe that as long as society allows upward mobility, meaning someone born poor still has a chance to climb, then inequality is merely a temporary disparity. Some even argue that inequality is a sign of vitality, that when someone becomes a billionaire, society has rewarded their talent. A widely cited example is the argument defending the wealthiest 1%. Steve Jobs or Steven Spielberg are seen as proof that when you create unique products that serve millions, being fairly compensated is reasonable. In this view, the wealth gap is not injustice, but a natural outcome of creativity and hard work. However, when contrasted with real-world evidence, these beliefs become shaky. Look at intergenerational mobility. Nearly 90% of children born in 1940 had a higher standard of living than their parents at the same age when they grew up. For the generation born in the 1980s, this number was only half. A society once celebrated as the land of opportunity suddenly resembles a ladder whose rungs are increasingly far apart, making it difficult for those born at the bottom to climb. If we extend the comparison to Canada, the picture becomes even clearer. Boys born into poor families in Canada are less likely to remain at the bottom than in the US. Wealthy children in Canada are also less likely to remain fixed at the top of the pyramid. Much of this difference stems from education costs. In the US, wealthy parents buy homes in areas with good schools and pay high tuition fees, ensuring advantages for their children. In Canada, the public education system is less expensive, narrowing the opportunity gap. If inequality isn't a concern, then why is mobility declining precisely where the wealth gap is widening? If wealth merely reflects talent, why does parental economic power so strongly predict a child's fate? One of the deepest-rooted illusions is the belief that income is directly proportional to contribution. In this view, whoever earns more is more productive, more innovative, more deserving. But the truth is not that simple. Many studies have shown that executive directors with million-dollar salaries do not necessarily deliver superior results for their companies. Sometimes, colossal compensation packages can even diminish efficiency because they encourage short-term management, focusing on personal gain rather than the long-term sustainability of the business. If we compare historical figures, the gap is truly thought-provoking. Albert Einstein, one of the minds that changed humanity, in 1933, earned only about 10 times the average worker's income. Today, top executives command salaries hundreds, even 300 times that of their employees. Does this enormous disparity truly reflect productivity, or does it merely show how the reward mechanism has become distorted? The conflation of wealth with morality also distorts societal norms. When a political leader once declared that money is just a way to keep score, he implicitly viewed wealth as proof of superior qualities. But money has never been a fair game. The wealthy do not directly compete with each other for every dollar. Most profits are generated by extracting resources from those least able to resist. Turning wealth into a measure of character is nothing short of legitimizing dispossession. More disturbingly, society has gradually equated profit with legitimacy and price with value. Success is no longer measured by product quality, employee treatment, or community engagement. Instead, wealth rankings and billionaire lists are lauded as symbols of achievement. When wealth becomes the sole metric, all methods of acquiring it, however distorted or exploitative, are easily legitimized in the public eye. As for the poor, assurances that they are still better off than others elsewhere are merely a denial of reality. Data shows that over 12% of American households lack stable food sources, and about 5% experience severe food insecurity. Among these are tens of millions of children who regularly face hunger. A global survey also revealed that over 20% of American families admit they cannot afford necessary food, a number twice as high as Canada and many times higher than France or Germany. This isn't just about meals. It's proof that even in a wealthy country, material deprivation can become the destiny for millions. Therefore, it cannot be measured by absolute standards like, the poor in America have refrigerators, so they're fine. It must be understood in a specific social context. A child who cannot attend a good school because their parents cannot afford the contributions is still deprived of opportunity, even if elsewhere in the world there are children without classrooms. Poverty is relative. It's being left behind within one's own community. All this evidence leads to an inescapable conclusion. Economic inequality is not just a statistic, not just a question of fairness. It is the root that shapes the entire social order, deepening every other gap, from education and healthcare to human dignity. Ignoring it, we will never understand why many people strive their whole lives yet can never rise above their circumstances. Nor will we understand why society is increasingly divided into two chasms difficult to bridge. Tracing back to the earliest civilizations, we find small clay tablets inscribed with symbols in Ur, not for decoration, but to record a promise, to exchange a sheep, a measure of wheat, or a jar of oil in the future. From that, humanity created a tool that allowed communities to trust in things that did not yet exist. This was the seed of finance, the ability to transform belief into something of exchangeable value. Spanning across Rome, China, and Islamic empires, variations of this tool grew increasingly sophisticated. early banks, bonds, shares, public debt. It not only allowed states to raise mighty armies, but also helped merchants embark on risky sea voyages by depositing a commitment. Humans gathered the strength of many strangers into a common project. For most of history, finance served as a servant. It operated behind the scenes, transferring resources from where there was surplus to where there was need, creating balance for the economy to function. But as the late 20th century progressed, especially in its final decades, that position changed completely. The quiet servant suddenly became the orchestrator, setting the rules for the entire American economy. The evidence is clear in the numbers. Before 1980, the financial sector accounted for only about 15% of corporate profits, but by the early 2000s, that percentage soared to over 40%. Simultaneously, financial employees, from stockbrokers and fund managers to bank specialists, earned incomes about 70% higher than workers in other sectors. This disparity reflected not only money, but also a new status. Finance became the elite class, dominating how society measured success, thereby influencing politics and culture. Many high-ranking government officials had roots on Wall Street, and business leaders increasingly viewed their careers through a financial lens. Societal norms of achievement were also bent, tied to the ability to profit from financial instruments rather than from concrete products or essential services. Even manufacturing and commercial companies, which previously focused on expanding factories, creating jobs, and ensuring long-term stability, began to shift their focus. Profits were no longer prioritized for reinvestment. Instead, most were used to pay dividends and buy back shares. The paradox was that for many years, the amount spent on shareholders even exceeded actual profits earned. This forced businesses to sell assets, borrow or cut research, training, and jobs just to maintain the temporary satisfaction of the stock market. Thus, the flow reversed. Instead of the stock market raising capital for businesses, businesses turned to feeding the stock market. Those who benefited first were short-term investors, hedge funds, and executive management who were compensated with stock options. Workers, long-term projects, and community safety were relegated to secondary concerns. This was not just a change in accounting books, it was a shift in how value was defined. Previously, value lay in tangible products, job opportunities, and essential services for society. Now, value was reduced to stock prices, a fluctuating number on a screen, sensitive to every click. This transformation revealed the new power of finance. It no longer stopped at capital circulation, but became a force dictating behavior, compelling even those outside the industry to conform. And when finance began to define success for the entire economy, the old order, where it was merely a servant, was truly inverted. The expansion of finance did not stop at redefining corporate objectives. It permeated every corner of life, from multinational corporations to ordinary households. Many manufacturing or retail companies began to operate as small banks, issuing credit cards to customers, engaging in lending, and even directly speculating in financial markets. The boundary between industries blurred, and financial logic became the common language. For families, that language was not a choice but a pressure. In the 1970s, household debt was only about 65% of disposable income. By 2007, that figure exceeded 130%. Home loans, student loans, credit cards, and then retirement fund investments all transformed each individual into a link in the financial machine. The disparity was most evident in vulnerable groups: women, people of color, young people. They borrowed more, paid higher interest, and were more likely to fall into the debt trap. Thus, a loop formed. Companies withdrew capital from production to pump it into shareholders and the stock market, while households emptied their pockets borrowing, then deposited money into financial funds hoping to secure their future. All flows converged on Wall Street, where a minority reaped colossal profits. The result was not only concentrated wealth, but also widespread fragility. When the market faltered, the entire society bore the brunt. To find the root cause, one must trace back historical decisions. In 1944, amidst the devastation of war, the Allied nations devised the Bretton Woods system, centering the US dollar pegged to gold. This made America the main axis of the global monetary order. But just 3 decades later, that position faltered. Trade deficits, wars, escalating inflation. By 1971, President Nixon was forced to end the convertibility of dollars to gold. Bretton Woods collapsed, giving way to another mechanism. The dollar, as Middle Eastern oil traded only in dollars, served as a new anchor for the U.S. currency. Yet the entire 1970s was a chain of crises: surging oil prices, unemployment, prolonged inflation, worker strikes. Public confidence wavered. Meanwhile, the business world began to fight back. They established research institutes, lobbying groups, and political funds to influence the government. Their goal was to dismantle barriers and restore profits amidst difficult circumstances. The real turning point occurred when a leader entered the White House with the famous statement, "Government is not the solution, government is the problem." Along with it came the belief that the free market was the cure for all ailments. The barriers erected during the Great Depression of the 1930s to prevent banks from excessive risk-taking began to be dismantled. Wall Street, instead of being restrained, was unleashed. Within corporations themselves, a new philosophy took root: maximizing shareholder value. Business leaders, compensated with stock, were compelled to do everything to increase stock prices. This created a dangerous incentive loop. Long-term investments were abandoned, jobs were cut. All resources were poured into short-term boosts. Corporate success was reduced to a chart line on the market, regardless of social consequences. All these developments show that the rise of finance was not a natural progression. It was the result of political choices, international agreements, and behind-the-scenes lobbying, step by step. From Bretton Woods to the oil shock, from Nixon to Reagan, from weakened unions to a booming Wall Street, a new order emerged. In this order, finance, from being a servant, became the master, redistributing wealth from the many to the few, and sowing the seeds for an ever-deepening inequality. A company exists for its customers, to sell goods, to make products, to retain loyal buyers. But gradually, in the final decades of the 20th century, that central position was replaced. Shareholders, the investors hidden behind trading screens, became the true customers. This seemingly technical upheaval dragged the entire economy into a different order, where profits no longer flowed to factories or workers, but circled back to feed the market itself. Previously, corporate cash flow primarily reinvested in itself, buying more machinery, expanding factories, investing in research, training personnel. Every dollar of profit was a seed sown for the future. But after 1980, that flow diverted. Profits were amassed as financial assets or poured directly out as dividends and stock buybacks. From promising to reinvest in production, businesses transformed into money-pumping machines for Wall Street. The numbers tell the story more clearly than any theory. Even in the 1980s, the ratio of dividends plus stock buybacks to profits climbed to unprecedented levels. In some years, it exceeded 100%, meaning that to satisfy investors, companies had to drain their entire savings, even selling off assets. From the 1990s, the phenomenon of negative net stock issuance became commonplace. Instead of raising capital for development, businesses bled themselves dry to pay back the market. By the early 2000s, almost all profits from non-financial companies flowed directly into shareholders' pockets, neglecting long-term investment needs. The inevitable consequence was the weakening of the businesses themselves. When factories weren't upgraded, when research was cut, when workers were seen only as expenses to be reduced, long-term growth potential vanished. Company executives might be satisfied with short-term stock price increases, but the foundation for long-term survival gradually decayed. From the outside, one might see high profits and soaring stock prices, but inside, there was a growing emptiness. Beautiful balance sheets were built on debt and the sacrifice of labor. The stock market, which was supposed to be a tool for raising capital for production, became a well that siphoned off all societal profits. This change didn't happen noisily. It was silent, presented in technical terms and annual reports. But to those inside, it was like a compass spinning. Once the direction changed, every decision, from investment strategy to human resource policy, had to adjust. And this new path led directly to dependence on the logic of Wall Street, regardless of the social consequences. After profits were siphoned back to the market instead of returning to production, many companies that were not originally banks gradually transformed themselves into financial players. From retail and energy to technology, everyone sought a piece of the lucrative pie. Sears, known as a catalog sales empire, no longer just sold home goods or clothing, but also issued credit cards, offered loans, and even poured retail cash flow into complex derivatives. Enron, initially an energy company, profited by trading contracts for everything from electricity and natural gas to even network bandwidth. This shift revealed a paradox. The larger the company, the more options it had to engage in speculation, the less commitment it had to its original business. Profits no longer came from selling products or services, but from short-term bets. This left workers, who relied on the stability of factories or stores, as the first to face insecurity. At the same time, the philosophy of shareholder value became the new gospel in management. Stock price, a number that fluctuates daily, was considered the sole measure of success. Business leaders were primarily compensated with stock options, compelling them to exert every effort to inflate that number, regardless of the cost. Stock buybacks became a popular tactic to drive up prices. Layoffs were also seen as a way to reduce costs and were immediately rewarded by the market. Massive borrowing both provided capital and served as a shield against takeovers, but simultaneously pushed companies into a vulnerable state when the financial cycle reversed. The question that must be asked is who truly benefits? Investment funds, especially fund managers who profit from asset size and short-term performance, reap colossal bonuses. Company executives also win big thanks to stock options. But for the majority of people, less than half of American households have a 401(k) or IRA account, and even if they do, the benefits they receive are meager compared to the risks. Market fluctuations can wipe out a decade's worth of savings in just a few months. More paradoxically, financialization itself contributed to weakening labor conditions. Full-time jobs with stable benefits gradually gave way to short-term contracts, flexible shifts, and precarious incomes. Companies, needing to maximize shareholder value, no longer viewed employees as assets to invest in, but merely as items to cut. While Wall Street recorded record profits, outside, millions of workers lived in constant insecurity. All combined to form an unmistakable picture. Businesses once pillars of production had now merged into the financial maelstrom. Profits fed the market, debt served as reins, and stock price became the compass. The result: the financial market swelled, while productive capacity, jobs, and long-term growth withered. The wealth gap, therefore, also widened, because those being nurtured were not the working majority, but the minority holding shares and power on Wall Street. For decades, Americans lived under the illusion that credit was the shortest path to freedom. Debt became as familiar as the air, permeating every decision, big or small: buying a home, paying college tuition, or simply surviving until the next paycheck. Yet, looking back at the numbers, we see a transformation too rapid to be considered normal. Before 1980, household debt was only about 65% of disposable income. By 2002, it had surpassed 100%, and just before the Great Recession, that number jumped to 132%. Never before had people lived so heavily on borrowed money. This explosion divided people into two camps. Some looked at it and saw a society being corroded: stagnant wages, escalating costs, and workers forced to borrow to maintain a minimum standard of living. Others were optimistic, believing this was an achievement. Cheap credit opened opportunities for the middle class, helping millions of families buy homes, go to school, and access the American dream. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere in between, complex and paradoxical. If we only look at the total amount of debt, we might imagine society suffocating. But when we calculate debt service costs relative to income, a different picture emerges. For many years, this ratio remained stable around 10% to 13%. This indicates that the problem wasn't in borrowing itself, but in how the burden was distributed. For some, debt was merely a tool. For others, it was a noose. Wealthy families borrowed a lot but at low interest rates, and their high incomes made repayment a minor issue. They even used debt as leverage, expanding investment portfolios, buying more real estate, and benefiting from tax breaks. For them, debt was not shackles but a ladder to climb higher. In contrast, the middle class relied on credit to maintain a certain standard of living. A suburban home, a new car, a college degree. All were built on loans. But just one small shock, like job loss or illness, could collapse the entire family. Debt, in this case, became an intractable burden. For those at the bottom, the story was even harsher. They often couldn't access mainstream credit. If they could, it was through predatory loans with harsh terms. The so-called expansion of credit access actually placed them in the most vulnerable position. The poorer they were, the less bargaining power they had, the higher the interest rates, and the more penalties they faced. Those who needed support the most were precisely the ones the system most thoroughly drained. From this, one truth becomes clear. Credit did not alleviate inequality, it deepened it. It was like a painkiller, allowing someone to struggle through the day but simultaneously masking an internal wound. When the pain returned, it was often more intense. While some segments of society used credit to accumulate more wealth, many others struggled to repay debt and ultimately lost their future due to never-ending loans. Expanding credit, therefore, was never a solution to the wealth gap. It only complicated the picture, on one hand offering some families the illusion of prosperity, while on the other pushing many others deeper into an inescapable vortex. And all coexisted, creating a society where debt was both a symbol of opportunity and a source of insecurity. When debt figures swelled, many still thought this was simply an inevitable result of a consumer society. But if we trace back through history, we see the hand of policy played a decisive role. From the early 20th century, policymakers viewed consumer credit as a cure for the social ill of inequality. Instead of asking why wages stagnated or why education and healthcare costs escalated, they believed that expanding borrowing capacity would be the solution. This perspective turned debt into a right, and the government sought to open the doors of credit to more segments of society. But understanding inequality as a lack of liquidity was a fundamental mistake. It transformed credit from a supporting tool into a source that recreated the gap. A typical illustration is the student loan spiral. In 1972, Sally Me was established as a quasi-governmental organization to guarantee education loans. More than 3 decades later, it became a fully private company, and the student loan market exploded. In just a few years of the early 21st century, the number of private loans increased from hundreds to tens of thousands, with high interest rates and harsh conditions. Meanwhile, default rates in some places reached 90%. Student loan debt, once promoted as a ticket to knowledge, effectively became shackles, dragging an entire generation into insecurity. For-profit schools knew how to exploit loopholes. Under the 90-10 rule, they had to prove that at least 10% of their revenue came from sources other than federal loans. Thus, private loans became a lifeline. Many schools even returned a portion of tuition as a bonus to lenders, solely to push students into debt. In some places, financial aid officers received gifts and lavish dinners from banks to direct students to preferred lenders. These crony relationships turned the need for education into a lucrative market, where profit was more important than the borrower's future. The power of the lending industry lay not only in contracts but also in politics. From the late 1990s, they spent millions of dollars on lobbying, contributed to election campaigns, and pressured for legislation to favor themselves. The climax was the 2005 Bankruptcy Act, which made student debt virtually impossible to discharge. Even with unemployment or illness, borrowers remained bound, turning student loans into safe assets for the financial industry. The picture that emerges is a cruel loop. Young people borrow to buy educational opportunities, believing that knowledge will lead them out of instability. But those very loans shackle them to the system. Upon graduating, before even starting their careers, they carry colossal debt, and when working in an already precarious economy, the ability to repay becomes fragile. Not a few choose to delay starting families, buying homes, or giving up dreams just to manage monthly payments. In the middle class, credit offered the illusion of stability. At the bottom, credit became a suffocating vice, and at the top, credit was leverage, creating more profit. This distribution shows that the nature of the problem is not how much is borrowed, but who borrows, under what conditions, and whose favor the ultimate outcome tilts. Household debt does not mean equal opportunity. On the contrary, it is an engine that reproduces inequality. Those who already have an advantage continue to use credit to go further, while those in need are pulled further back. The financial system, instead of flattening the gap, erected steeper ladders. And while millions live in anxiety over unpaid bills elsewhere, Wall Street safely profits from that very anxiety. If debt is one side of economic life, the other is how people accumulate wealth. Where debt is shackles, financial assets are leverage. And between these two extremes, American society reveals its deep stratification. The promise sounded appealing. Let everyone participate in the stock market, so stocks are no longer just a playground for the elite. Through retirement plans, through investment funds, ordinary people would also have a share in Wall Street's colossal pie. But when looking at balance sheets, the truth was quite different. The wealthiest families shifted significantly toward financialization in the late 1980s. About one-third of the top 1%'s assets were in financial forms. 30 years later, that figure exceeded 40%. Stocks, which once accounted for only about 12% of portfolios, had now soared to a quarter. Meanwhile, the role of tangible assets like housing and vehicles gradually declined. Their wealth was no longer tightly bound to physical assets, but to numbers flickering on the market. In the lower half of society, the picture was entirely different. Stock ownership only increased from 2.5% to 5% over 3 decades, and 80% of their assets remained tied up in essentials for living: a roof over their heads, a car to get to work. These things helped them maintain their lives but rarely created lasting wealth. When crises hit, the value of a home could plummet, while the mortgage loan remained intact. This disparity becomes even clearer when looking at stock distribution. Only 1% of families held about 40% of all stocks owned by Americans. The next 9% held nearly another 40%. The remaining 90% of the population shared a mere 20%. The promise of democratizing the market, turning everyone into an investor, was merely an illusion. In reality, the stock market became a funnel, concentrating benefits in the hands of a small group. For many families, the opportunity to participate in the market was tied to retirement plans like 401(k), S, or IRAs. They were promoted as a way for individuals to prepare for old age and simultaneously contribute to the economy. But the wealth gap remained evident even there. High-income earners could easily set aside a portion of their salary, receiving tax deductions and even employer contributions. This money not only accumulated, but also generated returns, turning retirement savings into a channel that increased disparity. As for low-income earners, many couldn't afford to contribute, meaning they lost both the opportunity to participate in the market and old-age security. In practice, the so-called financial democratization resembled a screening process. Those who already had an advantage saw their advantage amplified, while those who were disadvantaged were excluded or participated with such tiny amounts that it made no difference. And as the value of financial assets boomed, the wealth gap not only failed to close, but widened. Instead of bringing equality, the spread of the stock market consolidated power for the ultra-rich. It turned the promise of financial popularization into a beautiful but hollow illusion. If one only looks at the big picture, one might mistakenly believe that stocks at least open the door for everyone. But when disaggregated by race, the stratification becomes even clearer. Black families, even with comfortable incomes, invested in stocks less frequently than white families. This gap did not close, but widened as one climbed higher up the wealth ladder. A history of discriminatory lending practices, invisible barriers to banking access, and social networks that rarely encouraged stock investment all combine to form an invisible wall. The result is that inequality is not just about wages, but is deeply embedded in how wealth is accumulated across generations. Pensions used to be a stable anchor for workers. The parental generation could rely on fixed pensions after retirement, but that system was replaced by defined contribution plans like 401(k), S, or IRAs. On the surface, this allowed each individual to control their own future. But in reality, it shifted risk from corporations and the state onto the shoulders of workers. High-income earners easily contributed regularly, taking advantage of tax benefits and additional company contributions as a bonus. Low-income earners, however, struggled to the point where they couldn't set aside money and were left out. Thus, a tool designed to secure old age inadvertently amplified the wealth gap. This shift also consolidated the power of intermediary institutions. Fewer and fewer households directly owned stocks. Instead, they entrusted their money to mutual funds and hedge funds. For the wealthy, the proportion of stocks held by financial managers increased from about 40% to 75% in 3 decades. This meant that even as wealthy families accumulated more wealth, large rewards flowed to the intermediaries, those who collected management fees and held the power to decide capital flows. The layer separating household wealth from the real economy thus thickened. But inequality is not just a matter of class or race, it's also a story of generations. Boomers, born during the post-war economic boom, had many opportunities to accumulate wealth through housing and stocks, especially as new retirement plans were introduced. Younger generations, however, entered the labor market when housing prices were already high, wages stagnated, and student debt swelled, making it difficult to build their own financial portfolios. Thus, the gap between rich and poor added a deeper gap between old and young. Even deeper, it was a rupture between labor and capital. Those who lived on wages rarely had the opportunity to accumulate financial assets. Meanwhile, those who lived on capital from stocks and bonds to derivative products saw their money multiply continuously. This gap was not just about money, but also about power. Capital had a voice in policy, in the market, in how society defined success, while labor increasingly lost its standing. Thus, the promise that the stock market would become a common portfolio for all Americans became an illusion. Instead of distributing opportunities fairly, it locked wealth in the hands of a few and erected new walls between rich and poor, between white and black, between old and young, between capital and labor. Meanwhile, Wall Street continued to swell, nurtured not only by money, but also by the mistaken expectation that this was the path to economic democracy. After years of explosive growth, the spinning gears of the financial system finally slipped out of joint. It started with seemingly normal loans, a small house in the suburbs, a mortgage for a first-time homebuyer, a contract based on ever-increasing home values. But as the flood of credit surged, everything turned into a minefield. Subprime loans, mortgages based on home values packaged into complex securities, then sold worldwide. In those bundles of documents, risk was shredded, dispersed, and disguised as safety. This very disguise meant that when defaults began, no one knew where they were located, who held the ticking time bombs. Banks held toxic securities, investment funds held overlapping risks, the interbank market seized up, and the flow of capital that once smoothly traversed the economy suddenly became choked. When capital stopped flowing, the entire economic body seemed to freeze. Panic spread, businesses large and small struggled to find capital, families lost their homes because they couldn't afford payments. The stock market evaporated trillions of dollars. Never since the Great Depression of the 1930s had Americans faced such a financial abyss. On the brink of collapse, the government unleashed unprecedented responses. The TARP bailout program injected capital into financial institutions to prevent a cascading wave of bankruptcies. 2 economic stimulus packages were launched to revive consumption and employment. And a massive reform bill, Dodd-Frank, was enacted, promising to crack down on fraud, rein in excessive executive compensation, and reduce the risk from banks too big to fail. On the surface, all this offered hope. It seemed this time the system would pay, this time finance would be forced to yield to a more equitable order. People who had just lost homes and jobs believed a radical overhaul was imminent. But that hope was quickly challenged. Though many large banks were named and shamed, very few financial executives faced criminal charges. The bailout packages helped recapitalize institutions, but simultaneously placed them in an even stronger position. The market revived, stock prices rebounded, while millions still struggled with unemployment and foreclosures. The truth revealed a bitter paradox. The shock, which could have opened an opportunity for thorough reform, led only to a restoration of the financial system. Instead of being trimmed, it was reinforced to stand firm. And from the wreckage, it rose more powerful, more concentrated, more deeply entrenched in both politics and daily life. As the dust settled, many realized that what had transpired was not an overhaul but a restoration. New laws, emergency bailouts, all focused on addressing the short-term situation. injecting liquidity, reducing risk, punishing a few fraudulent behaviors. But the fundamental structure of the system that led to the crisis remained almost untouched. The difference became starkly clear when compared to the 1930s. After the Great Depression, America experienced a period called the Great Compression, where inequality narrowed due to radical reforms ranging from Social Security and labor laws to the fragmentation of financial power. Then, the shock became a catalyst for redistribution and strengthening economic democracy. After the 2008 crisis, however, inequality widened again. Incomes of the top tier quickly recovered, even increasing, while the bottom 60% saw their living standards decline. The heaviest losses fell on the middle and working classes, who had most of their wealth tied to their single homes. When home prices collapsed, assets evaporated, while mortgage debt remained intact. For many families, the crisis meant losing the entire economic foundation they had painstakingly built. In contrast, the wealthy class, which owned most financial assets, suffered fewer losses and quickly benefited as the stock market rebounded. The question arises, why did inequality worsen instead of being rectified? Many attribute it to the weakening of unions or the rise of the far right. These factors are partly true but insufficient. The core lies in the astonishing resilience of finance itself. By clinging to politics, utilizing lobbying channels, and demonstrating that the economy could not function without it, finance returned to the center of power faster than anyone anticipated. Policy responses, instead of decentralizing power, further concentrated it in a few giant institutions. And Wall Street and Pennsylvania Avenue, symbols of intertwined markets and politics, became more closely linked than ever. Roles that once belonged to the state, such as providing social welfare or guaranteeing credit, were increasingly privatized through financial intermediaries, and in corporate governance, shareholder value continued to be reinforced as the sole guiding principle. Thus, instead of ushering in a new era, the 2008 shock merely reaffirmed finance's supreme position. The consequence was that inequality not only failed to diminish but worsened. Families who lost homes, workers who became unemployed, not only suffered in the present but also lost future opportunities. Meanwhile, the financial system, rescued by the very hand of the state, emerged from the crisis with even stronger power. That is the paradox of our time. The crisis, which could have been a starting point for greater fairness, ultimately became a springboard to consolidate the old order. And from there, inequality continued to swell like a crack that was never mended. Thank you for patiently joining this journey. A book truly lives only when someone listens, reflects, and dares to engage with it. I hope what you've just heard is not just dry data, but a mirror reflecting our own lives, where numbers become questions about fairness, about how society treats one another. If you found something in these pages that resonated with you, please leave your thoughts. Sometimes a simple comment can illuminate what an entire collection of chapters might miss. And if you have a book you are eager to hear recounted, please suggest it, for who knows? That very story might open a new path for all of us. The ultimate lesson, perhaps, is this. The power of finance lies not just in the glass towers of Wall Street, but also hidden in every small decision: borrowing money, buying a stock, signing a contract. Understanding it is the only way for us not to be swept away by currents that seem too vast to resist. The paradox here is that individual fragility can become the starting point for a stronger collective awareness. I look forward to our next conversation, and who knows, the next book you suggest might be the key for us to delve deeper into questions left unanswered today.